Get started in just a few minutes, but while we're waiting, if you don't mind, double check to make sure that we are taking attendance, so double check to make sure that your screen name matches your actual name, so that way we can give you credit for attending. And we're going to go over some housekeeping rules in just a little bit. Everybody is muted right now, just to cut down on extraneous noise, background sounds, and things like that. But we will have time for Q&A or for questions or just comments later on during the presentation. But we're going to get started in just a few minutes. So bear with us and we'll go over kind of the agenda for today's training session and go over the details in just a little bit. We're going to get started in just a moment. Thank you all for making time to be here today. We really appreciate it. We know that you all have a lot of different responsibilities and a lot of different things going on right now, but we appreciate you being part of today's training session. This is going to be part one, response and recovery, in our service in disaster virtual training series. So, with the recent tornadoes in Western Kentucky, I know that disasters are on a lot of people's minds, as well as larger issues like climate change and just changes into the environment as cities grow out and people move from different parts of the country. All of that affects the natural world around us. It affects how people live their lives, and we want you to be aware of the way that those all interface to create hazardous situations, but also opportunities to make people more safe. So we're doing this training series a little differently than we have done previous virtual events. As you know, almost all of the registration was through Zoom, and because it is virtual, there are some technical difficulties that might arise. So we appreciate your patience. We hope that you find some value in the training that's going on, and we strongly encourage you to attend the next two training sessions that all dovetail with what we're going to be discussing today, but they help provide a comprehensive understanding of disaster services, disaster management, and the ways that you as individual people can participate and be part of this process. So my name is Andrew Stith. I'm the Training and Technical Assistance Coordinator for Serve Kentucky, which is the State Service Commission. Some of you may have met me before. You may have participated in a session that I led during the launch event in October. But my job is basically to interface with your AmeriCorps programs and with you as members to make sure that everybody's having a good experience and they're getting the support they need to be successful. With us today, we also have Holly Stone from Eastern Kentucky University's Training Resource Center, and Carrie Kazar, who is the program manager for Serve Kentucky as well. I have a few announcements before we start officially. Participants are being muted as they enter the room. We encourage you to strongly encourage you to remain muted unless we ask you to unmute. We have a lot of people on, and so it's really easy for there to be extraneous noise that kind of echoes throughout the different speakers. If you do have questions, enter it in the chat box, and we will moderate that closely to make sure that we can ask it. If you have an immediate question for the presenter regarding the topic at hand during discussion, you can use the raised hand button, which is in the lower part of your Zoom screen under reactions, and the host will then ask you to unmute. So just make sure that your microphone is muted. Make sure that if you have to step away from the computer, that you mute so you can talk to somebody else, and don't provide any additional distractions during the training. We will also run a Zoom report for attendance tracking. Like I said before, we're trying to make sure that everybody's screen name matches the name they use to register. So please change your name on your screen if possible, but we also want you to enter your name and your AmeriCorps program in the chat box. So that way we have a backup and a way to make sure that we can give you credit for attending today. The training will be recorded. So if you prefer to not be recorded or you don't want your face on it, you can turn off the video feed from your computer or your device on your screen. And there will be a short survey after we wrap up today's session. So as soon as you leave, you should be redirected to a screen that will ask you about 5 questions, just about did you find the event useful? Do you have any suggestions for future events or other things you'd like to see? So please don't exit your computer or device until you finished this survey, so that way we can get input from you all to make these future events better. And without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our presenter for today, Patricia Duggar. Pat Duggar has been the director of DEEM, now DEM, since it was first established in 1988. Since then, she spearheaded the development of a comprehensive emergency management program that links public safety with public health and other response and support disciplines. The program is inclusive of all hazards and all disciplines, and it's made to prepare Lexington and make them capable to respond to the most likely hazards that they will face. Before joining the DEM, she worked with the Division of Building Inspection from 1984 to 1988. Ms. Duggar has a BS from EKU and an MPA from the University of Kentucky. So join me in welcoming our presenter for today, Pat.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I really appreciate it. And I really look forward to the opportunity of speaking with you all. I love talking about emergency management and the discipline with folks. I think it's a great thing, and I love sharing the wisdom and giving everybody the opportunity to know a little bit about what happens in the process of disaster. Specifically today, we'll talk about response and recovery. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the PowerPoint, and then we'll go from there. Hopefully this all works. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, great. Kind of, the first thing we'll talk about, to just give you an overall view, is just the cycle of emergency management. And it is a circle because it's ongoing and continuous. You don't do one thing and then stop when you get to the end of the circle. So we kind of start with prevention. How do we prevent? And that's, it has a lot of different meanings. Part of it is law enforcement and how you prevent a crime. How do you prevent terrorism? How do you prevent other things? And then we prepare for what we know the hazards to be or likely to be in the jurisdiction that you live in. Then there's, if something happens, the response component. After that is over, then you go into a recovery phase, and we'll talk a lot more detail about those. And then after that, you look at how can I minimize, what actions can I take, what laws can I do to make the impact of those disasters less, and that's called mitigation. So I know one of my staff is going to talk to you in a future session about preparedness and mitigation. So I won't go into a lot of detail about those, but they are really important parts of the circle. Our mission here at Emergency Management, and this is pretty similar to what most emergency management agencies are, is just to enhance the public safety of our residents, our visitors, our businesses through that whole entire cycle. So that's what we hope to do, is get everyone prepared for the emergency, know what's going to happen when we respond, that we have a recovery plan, and that we're always looking for ways to make the impact less. Just a little bit about our office, just so you know, we have 9 folks that are regular classified Urban County government employees. We have 2 positions that are totally funded by a grant that are full-time, and 2 part-time positions. And then the numbers, I'm not going to go through all those, but that gives you an idea of our budgets. The LFUCG stands for the City of Lexington. That's the money we get directly from them. CSEP is part of our chemical stockpile emergency preparedness program, and that has to do with the nerve agent down in Richmond. And then the EMA, there's FEMA puts out an annual grant basically that is for emergency preparedness, and it goes from FEMA state to the state and then down onto the locals. And then we have what we call, again, and you'll learn more about this, mitigation grants. So that is kind of a fun, and all of these grants right now, all of this funding is open. So we're dealing with many, many different pots of money, which is a large financial challenge as well to manage all of that with us. some of the responsibilities we have in emergency management. And again, this is going to be for basically any kind of emergency management office, small or large. New York City is looking at the same types of things that we do here, as well as they do in London or Jackson or anywhere else. So you're always looking at doing emergency planning, and there's a lot of that happens, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Emergency operations, that's part of your response portion. How you alert and warn the public. You've got to have a continuity of government. If something happens to the building or the people, how do you continue government operations? Community education, that's part of the preparedness. We're constantly training not only our staff, but with our other partners, fire, police, Red Cross, hospitals. And then we also exercise the plans to see if there are any gaps or issues we need to address with training or policies. Terrorism, obviously, both domestic and international, as we all know, have come largely a bigger threat in the last 20 years, and then mitigation. So those are all the things that in big categories that we do. Some of you ask, I know, that what is a disaster versus an emergency? And basically an emergency is an event that is totally local, that local resources can manage on their own. It's usually coordinated somehow. A disaster means that the problem is so large, so impactful, that it needs resources beyond what you have locally. You may get mutual aid from other counties, you may ask the state, you may even need federal assistance. So a disaster means it's really overwhelming to the community, and they need a lot of additional assistance. Just to give you one little small trivia fact, I found this in actually putting this PowerPoint together. I thought it was interesting. The first known use of disaster was actually way back in 1567. So I thought that was kind of interesting that it really has been around for a really long time. Just so you know, and I'm not going to read through every single one of these, but I wanted you to know that there is state legislation that empowers local jurisdictions, governments, mayors, county judge executives to do and to have the things we have. Every county in the state of Kentucky is required to have these things. They have to have a local director and a local program. They have to have the LDSO as the local disaster emergency services organization. So every county has to have an advisory committee to the EM program to help them look at issues. Every community has to have an emergency operations plan. Every community has to have a continuity of government plan. So there are laws that state what are requirements for local emergency management programs. So there's a lot of legal authority in what's happened. And if you remember when COVID kind of first started, there was a lot of discussion with the legislature and the governor on the powers that the governor had. And those powers are very similar as to what local judges and mayors have. One part of this law talks about states and the other part talks about locals. So when the legislature was talking about limiting powers in this statute, it wasn't just for the governor, it was also for every single community. And I think that kind of got lost in the discussion that some of those bills and legislation could literally take powers away from your local leadership as well. And I think sometimes that's good to know. There's lots of other federal authorities. And again, I'm not going to read through all this. You can have the slides, but there's lots and lots of federal regulations and authorities that lean to us that we have to comply with during a disaster. The one that's most common, I think everybody has heard of, is the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Assistance Act. Some of you may have heard of the Post-Katrina Act, but there are lots and lots of others. I know during the COVID issue, again, you've heard about the Defense Production Act. So there's lots of federal laws. There's actually 63 of them, 17 executive orders, and 20 national directives that impact and tell emergency managers, local and state, how they have to operate and what their constraints are. Getting into response. some of you had asked the questions about NIMS and other things. In our resolution, when we adopted our local emergency management program and our emergency operations plan, there is actually an executive order that states that we have to comply with NIMS. And it has very specific language, as you can see, about terminology and interoperability and things like that, that are NIMS compliant issues. And so it's actually in the law, signed by the mayor and the council, that is how we will work in disasters and emergencies. So that's kind of the basis for how we structure and work in those situations. And if you haven't heard of NIMS before, it's basically for the National Incident Management System. So that gives you an idea of what it is. And it basically allows everyone to be on the same page. So if we were to get mutual aid, or we were to give mutual aid, everybody would be talking the same language. They would be using systems that are common to one another. So it really makes incorporating folks from other jurisdictions, whether that be across the country or across a county line, really know what's going on and be able to help one another in a smoother fashion than if we were all doing things differently. Alert and warning, that's another part of response, is that you have to have a way to get information out to the public. And I'm not talking about just general information, but that very specific, critical, important message, especially if you want them to take action, if you want them to shelter in place or to evacuate or stay away from a dangerous area. That is critical information that has to go out instantly. So we are the ones responsible for not only having those systems and determining what they are, but also the messaging that is utilized to go out on those systems. And trust me, there's a lot of practice with that, and it's not easy. I don't know if many of you have heard of WEA, the wireless emergency system. It's how now you can get things on your cell phone. And it's a system that the federal government created. And since some phones are still a little bit older, you're limited to 90 characters. Well, trust me, try to write down an emergency message that you want to tell people in 90 characters. It's really tough. So it takes a lot of work and practice and a lot of pre-staging. So listed on the sheet there on the slide is the types of ways we have. We have 30 outdoor warning sirens, and they also have PA capability. So if we do want to put out a verbal message on those, we can. We have WEA through the federal system. We have the basic way we can interrupt the cable systems and the TV systems with the emergency alert system. We have a radio system that is very specific to us. We run it and manage it, so we don't have to wait for the media to put something on it. And that covers most of Fayette County and a little bit of Madison and Clark. We have a system that's computerized where we can put information out to people that sign up. Also, we can use the WEA system as part of that. And then you can see in the one corner that big yellow device. It's called an Alertus beacon, and we have those in a lot of the schools and other public places, so that we can really quickly put an alert out to people where they may not have a weather radio in an institutional setting or something like that. It flashes and it has a very, very loud tone. So, and then you go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. We had a couple questions. One of our members wanted to know, is the AM 1620 radio station, is that statewide or is that regional?
It's local. It's very regulated by the FCC so that you can't interfere. I know Clark County has one, Louisville has one. So you basically apply to the federal communications system to get that radio system. So it's got to be less than 10 watts. So it's very local.
Okay, thank you. And then we also had a question from Julie. Julie, do you want to unmute yourself and go ahead?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, all right. Pat, I wanted to ask you this earlier. You were talking about the impact of the natural disasters and everything. I was just curious as to how much of like PTSD or other trauma related mental illnesses that you see after something like that.
And we'll get to that, but it's a really, really good question. And there's a lot of factors. It depends on, unfortunately, a lot of it depends on the poverty rate of the impacted community. It depends on other previous stressors they've had and how directly impacted they are by the disaster. But we will talk about that a little bit more in the recovery section, but that's a great question.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
We had one more question, Pat. Someone wanted to know, are the Alertus beacons, are those statewide or are those local or regional as well?
It's a private entity, so they're local, but I know that it started out actually at the University of Maryland. They developed it for their campus. So they're really well utilized on universities and institutions like that. But it's just, again, something that you want to choose as a local to do, and you work with the vendor. But it's really nice because we can isolate them like we have them in schools. So if we just have a school event, then we can just activate all the school beacons and tell them something. If we have something in the downtown corridor, we can turn on the ones for the Opera House and Rupp Arena and other various locations. So they are nice that they can be isolated into groups and sent out that way, or it can be a wholesale, like if it's a weather event, we can do that across the board.
So if I understand you correctly, it sounds like sometimes if there's a weather event, you might get an alert from like a federal agency or a national organization that says, hey, there's going to be a storm front coming through your area. But if it's an emergency that's localized to a particular community or town, then that organization or municipality would be responsible to saying, we're having an emergency now, we're alerting other people around us. Is that accurate?
That's correct. We have a lot of trucks and things that haul hazardous materials through Lexington. So if we had one of those overturned and it happened to be downtown, we could quickly, because we sit with dispatch, our office is located with our 911 center. We can very quickly get a message generated and out through those to shelter in place or take some other action that was immediate.
Thank you very much.
All righty. I just wanted to walk you a little bit through an incident response. And there's really kind of three types. One is an expected event coming, and that's a lot of that is weather related. We usually know typically 2 or 3 days in advance if something is possibly coming our way. Another one is an unexpected, usually a man-made event. That could be a hazmat situation or an active shooter or something like that you're not expecting. And then there's the planned events, large fairs, an athletic event, a political march, things like that are coming. They all require the awareness of the event. So how do you become aware? Sometimes we are watching, so we know when the weather's coming, we know it's happening, there's calls with the weather service. Other times we may be listening to our fire and police radio and hear something dispatched and recognize by what's being said in the volume that is something we need to track. So it just depends on how but you've got to know about the event. One of the next things you do is you start notifying whatever partners are appropriate for that particular type of event. Then you determine, do we need to go to the field, or is an EOC monitoring or an activation situation? Because we do both. And then you look at what all is involved and start trying to coordinate the incident. Emergency management's basic goal is a coordination. We're not in charge of the event. We coordinate all the parts and pieces. It's like a jigsaw puzzle, and you make sure all the parts fit together and everything is covered, and that some aspect of the event doesn't get forgotten or lost. So that's why we are communication, collaboration, and coordination are really the 3 C's of emergency management. Then after you kind of look at those things, you have to say, okay, is there public messaging that needs to happen that where you want the public to take action or take direction? And if so, that's the very next thing that has to happen and go out. And then you can start with just general public information about what's happening and anything else the public may need to know.
We had a question on who is responsible for making sure the warnings are released. Like, who makes that call?
Basically, it's our office, you know, and it may be done depending on the time of day or the hour. It may be done by 911, and they have a full set of standard messaging depending on the event that they would pick out and issue. Or it may be my staff itself that issues the messaging, depending on the situation. But it's our responsibility in emergency management to see that that message does indeed go out. Now,
Thank
we
you.
may get requests or information from police or fire or another agency that they need that to happen. And what kind of message, you know, fire may say, I need to have this area of town evacuated. And so that, but we will actually then issue that message.
Pat, I'm sorry if I could interrupt one more time. So how would members, or, you know, how would the people on this call figure out where their messages might come from? How can you find your local resources? So we know you're sharing a lot of information about Fayette County, and it's probably very similar in other counties, but is there a way to determine how you can get these alerts, or how you can get plugged into them in your various counties or city governments?
Yeah, I would say talk to your local emergency management director. As I said, every county has one. And sometimes it's someone playing a dual role. They may also be the fire chief. They may also be the 911 director, because in Kentucky, a lot of emergency management directors are part-time or volunteers, but they will know how they send out messaging and by what method and how you can sign up for things. So that's your best resource in learning that information.
Thank you.
An expected event, again, it's mostly weather, and you're monitoring the incoming situation. Like the last two snow and ice events that we had, you know, we were well aware what was coming in. We were tracking it. We were on phone calls with the weather service. And so we knew if XYZ happened, if we really were to get a half an inch of ice, we knew what impact that was going to have and what our biggest issues were. It was power outages. So then what does that mean? It means possible sheltering. It means people without power with electrical medical devices. So you kind of find out what the impact is, and you plan for those. And then we have an executive group, but every county probably has some list of people that they need to let know what is going on, whether it's the mayor and the county judge executive, the road supervisor. There's groups in every county that they want to let know what is coming so they can plan for those events. The school system, we keep a lot up with the university and the school system so they can have an idea. Should they be looking at calling school off or doing a delay? So, and then it's really up to us in this county, and I think that's the way it works in most counties. You make a recommendation to the elected officials. Now, obviously, they are in charge, and they can choose to go with your recommendation or do something differently, but they do look to the emergency managers with the knowledge that you have to make some of those recommendations. And then we share information as broadly as we can. And I think most of the other counties do that too, on our Facebook, website, Twitter, Nextdoor. Nextdoor is our local neighborhood group that has like a chat type thing. A lot of the neighborhoods listen to that, news conferences. So you try to get the word out to what people can expect, what you want them to do, as very best you can. And then the expected event could cause a partial activation of your EOC. It really depends on what the event is and what you are expecting that outcome to be. One thing I would say is don't wait until the event happens to try to open your EOC, because then it's really hard for people to get in. So if you anticipate at all that the event is going to be have road issues or travel issues, you know, it's easier to have people come in and send them home than be 3 hours behind the ball and be really slow in getting everything started. And then the phases of response really are immediate, up to 72 hours. And that's where all the life safety situation happens, the rescue, determining situational awareness, the sheltering and providing basic needs for people, the food, the water, things like that. And then that's also when the field and the EOC start getting together, and it's two-way communication. The EOC learns things from the field that they need to know to have total situational awareness in the room. And then the room also shares information to the field about what's going on. So you have to have communication and interface there to make it all work well. And then after 72 hours, normally in most responses, the life safety issues have been addressed. And you get into resource management and donations management and long-term feed and sheltering, a longer-term damage assessment. There's really two types. The first damage assessment, you're just really trying to create a situational awareness and identify life safety issues. What is out there that we've got to get to right now? The second damage assessment is more long-term, and it's more what you submit into FEMA to show the completeness of the damage so that hopefully you can get state and federal assistance for your community and for your residents. And then you're also looking at, in those after 72 hours, getting the restoration of the critical utilities started. And that can go 70, that can go on into the response, on into recovery. It just depends on the situation and the event and how much impact has been done and to what large scale. Okay, an unexpected event. Again, how did we learn of the event? What is the impact? It's really not much difference, except you didn't know about it, and now you're reacting from second one to scurry to try to get everything you had a little bit more time to get when you knew the event was coming. So it's really not much difference. It's just the time, and the timing is different on being able to prepare for the event that you know is coming versus you have to react. So that's really the biggest difference. And a planned event, typically, and we've had several of these, several years ago, I think it was 2010, we had the World Equestrian Games. Well, we literally planned for that event for 18 months. When we have, large, like now we're still hoping, even though Kentucky didn't quite do what they wanted last night, that we're going to be in the NCAA. So we're starting now to have discussions to prepare how we respond to the NCAA event. So that's a planned event. So you meet with the people that are going to be involved. We determine what type of size and what type of crowd. For Rupp Arena and 20,000 people, it depends on the concert. Will we have mostly elderly? Will we have teenagers? Will we have a mix? What kind of crowd are we going to have? And then what are the potential impacts that could happen if something goes wrong in that event? Is there anything we can do in advance to minimize those impacts? With NCAA, we go around and we pick up all the couches on the porches on campus so they don't have anything to burn. So, there's things that maybe you can do to minimize the impacts if that event were to go through. You make sure you have a plan and you have contacts for everybody that's going to be involved. And then you just monitor. I know that for several events, we have really used social media to monitor if something bad is being planned. And you wouldn't believe it, but people really do plan things on social media that are not nice things. And so can you be aware of those and maybe try to cut those off? During the World Equestrian Games, we learned that somebody had a heart attack in the stands by social media. Luckily, we in the command post were monitoring that. We quickly called on scene, told the medical folks to go to this part of the stands, and sure enough, there they were. So, you have to use all the tools that you have available to you. Again, now how do we activate the EOC if that is a requirement? And this is a picture of our EOC here in Lexington. And again, we provide coordination, communication, collaboration, planning. So our process is this: the people that have the authority to activate the EOC are the mayor, our chief administrative officer, the commissioner of public safety, and myself. Any of those people can say, hey, based on different criteria, we believe that we need to open the EOC. It may be fully, it may be partial, and then we are fortunate that we can do things virtually if we have to. That is not my first choice, because you miss the interaction in the room and you miss the conversations in the room, and it's just a little harder to do that virtually. We've had to do a little of that over the last 2 years with COVID, and I am not a fan. The mayor typically, or the county judge executive, will try to set the priorities for the event. But they can't do that until they know what's all going on. So that's, again, why you in the room are trying to develop what all's there, what's impacted, so that you can make recommendations to the mayor. Then the mayor sets the priorities. Then the EOC director will implement all of those with the people in the rooms, and then they will carry out the tactics of actually how they are going to achieve that strategy. We have some things that are automatic. We know if we have a tornado touchdown, we are automatically going to open the EOC. Sometimes we do that with communication with others. And depending on their answer, we may activate the EOC. For a lot of large scale planned events, we know we were going to activate partially in a monitoring mode, so we can watch what's happening. Again, once we activate, we have a notification of all of those people that work in the room. And we ask them to come in. We also have to notify the state that we are opening and activating our EOC. Again, the very first thing we're trying to do is to collect situational awareness. What is going on? What are the impacts? What is life safety? What is environment? What is property? Then we try to establish priorities with the mayor. And if we need assistance beyond our local resources, then that's when that begins to happen. Just to give you an idea of what's in ours, and we're very, very fortunate that we have the people. Like I said before, one of the roles that you all will find, and we talk about this a little bit later on in my presentation, is that most counties, the emergency management staff may be 1, 2, a half-time, or a volunteer. So they're not going to have the people already in place to fill all of the positions that you see there on the screen. So if you're interested in serving in that capacity in your jurisdiction, again, talk with that EM director and offer up, and we'll talk more about how you do that, but offer up that maybe you'd want to serve in the EOC. Because, it takes a lot of people to manage an event, especially if it's as large as it was in the one in Western Kentucky or the one we had in Liberty several years ago, and things like that. Most EOCs, and the way FEMA now describes it, is by structure. So when you're coordinating an area, you're coordinating a functional area, not a specific division, unless that's all you have. In Lexington, again, we're a little bit unusual because with health and medical, we have 7 hospitals, long-term care facilities, the blood center, all kinds of things for that group to coordinate with when we're looking at a disaster. You may just have a health clinic or the health department or one hospital or no hospital. So again, it's going to depend on the size of the community, but this is flexible and expandable. You can make it really small, or you can make it as large as we have it. And that's what the nice thing about NIMS is, you can grow it or you can compact it down to what the needs are of your specific community. It doesn't have to look like ours in Fayette. But this just gives you an idea. These are the ones that are actually listed in FEMA guidance. And then we also have volunteer organizations, schools, and that's all schools. The Fayette County school system is our lead rep, but they coordinate with all their schools, all the private schools and the universities. Plus, right now, schools also has daycares. So they have their hands full with what they're trying to coordinate and work with. Then we do a lot of mapping. So we also have our GIS folks in here. And just really recently, we have been able to get a member from the staff of the Chamber of Commerce to come in and help us liaison with all the business needs and the two-way street there. So that's another. Private partnerships is really, really important in emergency management. Just gives you an idea of what a standard EOC is. Not everyone will have this, but we have a large operations room. We manage everything in a web-based system called WebEOC. So it does allow us to do a lot of things virtually and have communication. We have a separate room with radios and communication than our 911 dispatch. One of our factors in determining whether or not we need to open the EOC is 911 being overwhelmed by calls that are non-life threatening, that are specifically related to the disaster event. If we go that route, then in this room, they can dispatch disaster related units as opposed to everyday taking care of emergency related units. We have a joint information center, a JIC, and a press room. We have a room adjoining the operations room that the policymakers can go in. We have a room just for state folks and a room just for federal folks. And then 311 and 911 both are in our building, our call take center, 311 and 911. We are tied at the hip when it comes to a disaster. So it makes it really good in response that we can share information and be together. And then we're fortunate that we do have a kitchen and a pretty small bunk room where if people had to stay over, they could do that. The concept of operations, again, and you'll see me get a little redundant with, we're trying to develop situational awareness. And that's one of the things that takes a lot longer than I think people realize. And in Western Kentucky and Mayfield and Dawson Springs, I know people wanted to react immediately to start sending things and doing things. Well, that's not a good idea because it really does take about 72 hours in a large disaster like that to really determine what is going on and wrap your fingers around it and figure out what you need. So just, if I can say anything, try to be patient in future disasters with those first 72 hours and allow the emergency responders and those folks to deal with the life safety issues and really figure out what it is they need. And then, try to figure out ways to help, and we'll talk about that. Also, you're trying to establish priorities and resource needs. That's one of the things you're doing in situational awareness. You're trying to figure out, in a disaster like they had in Mayfield, there was more than one priority. They had several really big critical things going on. So how do I allocate resources and personnel adequately and efficiently to make sure everything is being addressed? How do I assess the threat? They had live power lines down and people were walking through downtown. That was kind of a dangerous situation. So what are the other threats and impacts that are hazardous and dangerous that have been caused by the disaster that you have to address? Tasking assignments, again, getting back to the damage assessment. And then really when you come to it, you're collecting the information you get, you're analyzing it. Basically, is it true? Is it correct? Is it valuable? Can you depend on that information? Verification, again, that's the same thing as that. You're going to display the information so people are aware of it. And then you're going to get that information out either to the field folks. I know that we sent some firefighters and one of my staff to Mayfield Saturday after it happened, and trying again to verify. They were one of the people on the scene at the candle factory, trying to give them verified information about the situation there, the situation downtown, so that they could then disseminate the information out to either state partners or others. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Pat, I'd like if you could clarify a little bit. You sort of touched on how everybody, when they hear about a disaster, they want to help out, they want to go to the site, they want to, bring water bottles and clothes and things like that. What are some of the challenges that arise when you have spontaneous volunteers, or when you have people showing up to a place where they don't necessarily have that operational awareness, or they don't have specific training? How does that complicate things for first responders and for emergency managers?
That's a great question. And basically they're not prepared to handle that yet. All of their resources, especially in smaller communities, all of their resources are going to those first life safety 72 hours issues. And so when you want to come and help bring food or water or other things, they have no way to receive it. They don't know what to do with it. They haven't planned for it. They're still trying to get their hands around the overall disaster. Now, we'll talk in recovery a little bit about how you can do that effectively, but you have to kind of stop the urge from just rushing in, because one, you could be putting yourself in danger, and that's definitely not what you want to do. So that's a good question, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. One of the other things in response is you have to record things. You have to have a record. One, it's just good business practice that the sequence of the events, important decisions that were made, all of that has to be documented. One, that's the only way you're going to be able to get funds back from FEMA if a presidential disaster is declared. Without great documentation, you're not going to get any money back. And unfortunately, the second reason is for litigation. So if something does happen in that disaster situation during any part of it, from the response through recovery, without documentation, so you can say, 2 years from now, oh yeah, on December 8th, this was done, without having proof, then you're more likely to not come out in a good side of the outcome in litigation. So, but you just have to have documentation. And then the other reason is you really want to do an after action hot wash and report. And if you don't have things documented, relying on people's memory that have just worked through that, maybe also lived through it locally, is really difficult. So it's hard to make improvements without accurate information about what really occurred. So, improvements in the response, recovery of funds, and litigation are your three big primary reasons that you've got to have some system for documentation in the response phase. And then, it's really important to keep the public informed as to what's going on, where they can find resources, where they can find, once you do set up a point of dispensing of whatever it may be, where they can find that, what's going on. It's real important to have some method established to tell people things, to dispel rumors. Maybe they heard there was 38 dead and there was none. So you want to try to keep information flowing to the public in some sort of timely fashion, in a way that they are used to receiving information. So that's just a really important. And of course, you want the information to be with one voice. You don't want the fire department saying one thing and the mayor's office or the county judge executive, and then you all three saying three different things. So another reason to have kind of everybody on the same page when it comes to public information. You do have some abilities from the local level with a declared local emergency. And that's one of the first things I always encourage my mayor to do. There's really no bad side to declaring a local state of an emergency if you feel like it's needed. One, it gives you the ability to ask for state resources. It gives you some protection liability wise. And these are just an example of some of the agencies that you can ask for in a declaration of emergency from the local to the state level. And then if the state also were to declare an emergency, it allows you then to have assistance from the federal government in actually response capabilities, much less the recovery. But this is mostly talking about actual response capabilities for the response phase of this. Any questions? Then when the federal government declares a presidential declaration, that's when you get into public assistance, which basically is for the government. People get sometimes confused, but public assistance is really referred to as the assistance that the federal government can give back to your local government. And there's different categories that falls under and ways that they can get reimbursed compensation. And then there's what we call individual assistance, and that's what is really for the citizens. And there's lots of lots of categories. If you have insurance, if you don't, what kind of damage you have. And so there's all kinds of things. Nothing will happen if you don't apply. So these are the two websites and phone numbers. FEMA says they never, ever, ever, ever change. So if you want to write them down, they don't change. They keep them there for every single disaster. But you have to apply. And I would encourage anyone to do that. And then there's a chain we'll look at in just a second as to all the different types of assistance. And it's not simple, but there should be people locally, either from FEMA or from the state or local, that can help you work through that. There's a lot of voluntary agencies that will provide assistance to individuals, and a lot of household programs. Talk just a little bit about two cases that we had locally. One was Flight 5191. This was a very unexpected incident. I got a call at 6 o'clock in the morning from the fire chief telling me about it. Some of the difficulties was the crash scene was not on airport property. So you had the airport involved, obviously, because that's where they started from. That's where the airlines was. You had the crash scene, which was offsite. We had set up a family assistance center for the families of those people on that flight in a totally different location in town. Then we had the morgue, which was actually ended up using the morgue in Frankfurt because we, like most counties, have very, very limited morgue capability here in Lexington. So we also had the EOC open, and then we had the airlines itself, which has a lot of authorities and responsibilities in an airline crash. So you had the airport public safety, you had the NTSB, who was investigating the crash, and they have absolutely total authority and rights when it comes to the crash scene. We are basically just there to support them. So we had, and then we had the FBI and other elected officials. So it was more than just one site. So you had the airport, you had the crash site, you had the assistance center, and you had the morgue. So we were trying to coordinate and manage events for this process in 4 different locations. We also had to manage and coordinate what happened with the NTSB, the airport, and the families. So it was a very complicated site, very complex, and it made it a little bit unusual. And we also went from response was like maybe an hour, truly. And then it was instantly recovery, which is very, very unusual for the response to be that quick. And then you're automatically into recovery and how you manage all that. So it was a very unique situation with lots of sites and lots of different authorities that you had to coordinate and work with to make everything happen. And as someone asked about stress and things like that, behavioral issues, that was a huge issue with here. We had to both provide counseling and issues for both the families at the site. So we had several professionals at the site trying to, help with families, but also it was a really, really traumatic event for the first responders. So we also had those issues in counseling and providing for things there. I think truly one of the best things that was done sometime later for that whole stress and issue was the establishment of the memorial with the birds and everything. I don't know if anybody's ever had a chance to see it, but having the families come out there and having it there anytime they want to go, but it's away from the site. I think is one of from what we've heard from the families, is one of the best things that was really helped them long term in dealing with this issue. So again, you have to think about the needs of the family and how you're going to help with those long-term stressors that in PTSD that we've talked about. So and that is, I'll be honest, that is one of the things that we've actually started a committee here last year on continuum of care. In that, in most disasters, the Red Cross or other professionals are there initially, and they can do some initial counseling, maybe up to 30, 60 days. But then what? What's the continuum of care for families or responders that still need that? So we're trying to look at how does the Red Cross or those professionals that do the initial, how do they pass that information on or make sure that they are in someone's queue for long-term issues? So it is a gap and it's a concern, but I think it is finally starting to get a little bit more attention in both the social services and behavioral health and the disaster emergency management community to work that link together. So I think that's a positive in that regard. The other, sure, go ahead.
Pat, thank you for all this information. I was just going to say a lot of our members, they work at, they do their service in schools, or they work alongside, social workers and things like that. And I think you did a really good job explaining the ways in which, emergency responders and first responders can go to a site, but then that's not when the work is done. There's the rest of the work dealing with how does the community respond to this, and how do we move resources around so that we can fix a problem, or that we can provide emotional support to people, or that we can help people who are dealing with trauma. Because like you just said, sometimes the lasting impacts of an emergency or a disaster are with the people who still have to stay in that community for months or even years afterwards.
And I can tell you this just from a personal experience. I worked that situation and I was out at the scene off and on for a week or two. And that same type of plane frequently flies out of Lexington. And the very next time I had a flight, and as soon as I walked through that initial door onto the plane, I froze. Because I could remember what all was behind what you see. It looks like a nice wall and all this other stuff, but I saw what was behind all that. And it took me a minute to be okay to walk into the rest of the plane. So it is long-term, and we need to do a better job about that.
We also have another question from Julie. Julie, do you want to unmute yourself and ask?
Yes, Pat, you had talked about the continuum of care, and I was just wondering, do any churches or nonprofits help in that area?
Typically, they can, and we have a list of pastoral folks and the police and fire chaplains and various things that help, but typically it's not long term. Again, it's that immediate to 30, real lucky if it's 90 days out. So what we're trying to determine is the longer term, because as we all know, it could be years sometimes for the effect of some of these disasters that have on folks. So we do, but in the long term is what the best I can describe it is kind of hit and miss for folks. So that's what we're trying to see, if there's a better path, a structured path forward for ensuring long-term care. The other one is the ice storm, and I know I need to hurry because I've only got a little bit of time to finish the recovery part, but it was the big thing here is it was the entire community. It was not just a section or a piece. It was all of Fayette County that was impacted by the ice storm. It was our longest EOC activation. It was 8 days, 24/7. And we had preparedness because we knew it was coming, but we didn't quite know we were going to get that much ice. And we learned a lot about the community with it being that long. And we really worked a lot to prepare for something in the future with our health department and our social workers and the Red Cross for looking at what ended up being the impacts that we had not been able to foresee, unfortunately. So we're now much, much better prepared for that than we've ever been before. Okay, recovery it's usually the way they describe it, it's short term is 90 days or less for you to recover. And that's not at all talking about behavioral health, mental health issues. That is strictly restoration of infrastructure, debris removal, housing, and basically feeding, medical care. It's basically a short-term time that it takes to get the community kind of back to the way it was before or as close as possible. Long-term is 90 days to 18 months, but lots of recovery takes years and years. And sometimes, and again, those are the tough ones. And that's when you really have to look at things that deals with permanent housing versus, the people in Maysville have gone from rooms in the state park to travel trailers to, we don't know yet, hopefully permanent housing. So we're still in that process. How do you bring businesses back into your community if they've been destroyed? How do you get people to come back? Sometimes that's a real issue. There's been several cases, one in Alabama, one in Kansas, where people just decided they were walking away and the town still looks exactly like it did when it got hit with the disaster. So, sometimes just getting your people to come back is a real challenge. And restoration and recovery, basically, when you say you're recovered, it's that you get the community as close to normal as possible or better. So again, those are the two phases of recovery. Short term it's going to have to be a really minor disaster and probably was not a federal declaration for you to have a 90-day recovery. About 40% of businesses that are affected never reopen. So if you imagine, look around your town and you wipe out 40% of businesses, that's going to be a huge economic impact. So again, that goes back to the preparedness phase that Tim will talk about and what you can do in the preparedness phase to hopefully minimize this impact. And 65% of those that do reopen struggle to remain profitable. So again, that economic engine is a big challenge and opportunity for folks. This is just a little bit, and I know it's a busy screen, but it's a recovery line that has been looked at with some of the major disasters in the U.S. And you can see when you get into some of the long-term funding like HUD or other business appropriations, and you get that complete, we're talking 4-6 years out here before things really start to happen for a community. That's a long time for communities to be kind of in the middle and really trying to survive and get through to that final recovery phase. So, recovery is difficult. A lot of people still are in shock that in Katrina down in New Orleans, that they're still recovering, but they are, because it was such a massive disaster with so much impact that you see that still happening. So just remember, recovery truly is long term, and we'll talk about ways that this can be, the timeline can be shortened a little bit. Down in Tuscaloosa on April 27th, and this group is really a great example of recovery and restoration. They had an EF4 tornado that was a mile wide. Just imagine that. It was a mile wide, and it landed on the ground for 6 miles through the center of the town. It totally flattened the whole commercial artery of downtown. It took out the hospital and lots of city buildings. In total, they had 5,362 homes damaged or demolished. That's a lot. especially for a small community. I know it has the University of Alabama, but believe me, Tuscaloosa is not a large town at all. They had 53 dead and they had 1,200 injured. But what was the issue? They had no hospital. So what do you do with these people? And then once they took the final assessment, they realized that 12.5% of the city was actually destroyed. And all of that destruction and damage took 6 minutes. 6 minutes. So they looked at things and they had in their economic strategy and some other things, they already had some visions, I'll say, for maybe what they could do if. And as bad as this tornado was, they took the opportunity to not just rebuild as it was, but to revitalize the whole community and rearrange how things were laid out, where things were placed, how they built. Their building standards were much stronger now and more wind and tornado resistant than they had been. So they created a group, economic folks, business folks, city folks, the school, and they really came up with a plan on how they wanted to redo the city with codes, with locations, the way they brought in businesses. They developed a lot of private partnerships with businesses. So they chose to revitalize rather than rebuild. And that's a big deal. So how do you restore? Well, you have to have a plan. And no one, let me tell you, the weakest link in emergency management across the country is recovery. Nobody thinks about it in advance. The minute the disaster happens, somebody within the organization, and I don't just mean in the EM office, but somebody within that organization should start a recovery plan if you don't already have one. And again, do you want to build back the same or do you want to change things? You have to look at regulations. When we had our tornado, and it was a small one here at Masterson Station, one of the issues was the process of getting a building permit. People were without a home. We didn't want to wait 6 weeks to get a permit and start building. So how do you streamline that process? What exceptions do you make in that rebuild to make things quicker? How do you get your economic growth back? How do you entice businesses to come back to your community? Restoration of infrastructure. Again, do you want to do it differently? Can you afford, whether it's a public or private utility in a partnership, can you afford to put all that underground if it was a tornado so it's not as at risk? So there's a lot of things to take in. But you got to take care of the people. And again, here we get into the behavioral health, the jobs, the other types of things. There's got to be someone who is working on those issues in a plan. So there is a template out there for a recovery plan, and all the different sectors, I guess is the best way to put it, that you have to think about and putting this back together. But it has to be a partnership between the community, the citizens, the businesses, and the government. No one entity can do a recovery plan or actually implement something alone. It's real important that all those people be involved. Now, how do you prepare myself to help? How can you be ready to help? Well, one, don't even think about going in the emergency immediate response phase of a disaster. Just don't go. Make sure you leave that part to the trained professionals. Don't become part of the problem. I've seen so many people who've wanted to help and ended up getting themselves in trouble and actually needing resources and responders to come help them. Please make contact with your emergency manager, your fire chief, someone that has these roles and responsibilities. Get to know locally the needs and capabilities of your community. What can you all do? And then how can you help fill the gap? How can you help fill that gap that what's not there? Like I said, I can assure you, if you go to most emergency managers in the state, they're not going to have a full cabinet of people to fill an EOC. Don't go unless you're asked to come and you've made arrangements through some official person to go. Know where you're going, who your contact is, what your role and responsibility is going to be, and what do you need to take. Maybe you're going to need to have to do your bring a cot and a sleeping bag, bring your own food, bring your own water, because we don't have the resources to take care of you. So make sure to ask all of those questions. And for heaven's sakes, make sure safety is first. Prepare yourself. How can you become more prepared? I don't know if you have CERT in any of your communities, but if not, maybe you could start one. Maybe you could start a CERT thing and get people literally trained in how to do neighborhood response. And also you could be an asset then to the professionals. Yes, Andrew.
Pat, I was wondering if you could just tell people what CERT stands for.
Sure. It's the Community Emergency Response Team. And basically it's for citizens. And we train people with about 30 to 40 hours of training to do basic things, first aid, how to put on a tourniquet, how to assess, how to use a radio, what is incident command. So again, it gives you enough. One, you could be kind of a responder in your own community, because most of us don't have enough people to go around if something bad were to happen. So do that. Develop your own family disaster plan. If you don't know what you and your own family are going to do, you can't go help someone else if it's your location where something happens. Make yourself an emergency preparedness kit. So again, whether you have to evacuate, you have to shelter in place, or you're just there, you have the things that you need for at least 72 hours to get by when things are not normal.
Pat, if I could also interject just two quick things. So for our members, our AmeriCorps members that are on board, we are working with your program directors to get them to start finding the resources that you guys will connect with at some point, and helping you guys build kind of a plan for how your programs will respond in these events. And so we are working on trying to build a plan within Serve Kentucky as a whole, and all of our AmeriCorps programs, and down into our communities. And so we're collectively working, but we wanted to present this to you guys so that you can see all of the moving parts that it takes to respond, and so that we can start, as Pat is talking about here, preparing and getting ready for the next disaster. And so there's a lot to unpack in what we've learned today, and there's a lot that work that we're still going to need to do, and we're going to try to work collectively with our programs and with you guys to start building better resources and connections. But I also wanted to let you know, Pat, there's a question in the chat. Shelby said that she knows, I know that a problem here in, I'm assuming Bowling Green, after the tornadoes, was having a huge influx of community support and donations, but at times poor coordination of those efforts and difficulty during distribution. Any thoughts on ways or ways issues like that can be mitigated?
Sure. I think, again, a lot of the smaller emergency management offices don't have a lot of staff. And so if you can go to them in advance and say, pick up something that you might have an interest in. Maybe you like doing social media, and they have something like that, but they can't do it themselves. Maybe you could offer up that, hey, when we have a disaster, I'll be glad to come in and start posting information to the public through social media. With something like a distribution center, it takes a lot of organization and a space. If you have an interest like that, maybe you could work with the local EM and identify places within the community that could be large enough to hold whatever you're going to get. It could be clothes, it could be water, it could be food. Like with Bowling Green and everything else, they wanted space heaters. They wanted, very, very specific thing, diapers. So, work with them if you have something that really interests you, so that you could maybe be the one that helps them out in establishing that, talking to some of your church members or AmeriCorps friends or whoever and saying, hey, let's be the distribution group for a disaster. And here's kind of what we'll do. This is where we'll go. this is how we'll set it up, we'll catalog it. And there's things out there that can teach you and show you how to do that. But it's really just getting involved with your local fire department or EM on knowing what their capabilities are and trying to figure out ways that you can either fill the gap or you can try to spearhead a group to help fill the gap, because it's a huge need.
And obviously, it's not the time to do this is not right after a disaster has struck. The time to do it is obviously, Shelby, being in Bowling Green right now, you're recovering, but for people not in an immediate disaster zone, the time to start thinking about what impact you can have and how you can be a part of that is when what we call blue sky events. And that's when things are clear and everything is good. That's the time to go to that, because when they're in emergency mode, they don't have time to go through and, how can I plug you in? Where can I put you? It's that spontaneous volunteer that we talked about before. So, as you're thinking about ways that you can be a part of this, the time to do it in your community is when we're having these blue sky events. Or blue sky days, I should say.
Correct. The only thing I'm going to say about the emergency kit is make it specific to your family. There's a lot of things that people recommend to be in there, but you got to make it specific to your family, what your needs are. If you have kids, elderly, other things, pets, just make it specific that way. Here's some trainings I would suggest that if you're looking at helping your community where you are, is that definitely take first aid, CPR, and the AED. There's a lot of AEDs out there now that if you learn to use them can be a real benefit. The ICS 700, 800, 100, and 200, they're all online with FEMA. They take a couple hours to take. That will give your emergency manager or fire chief a lot of comfort to know that you have those and probably understand the process and the system, and that you're not going to be just totally foreign to what is going on and how everything works. If you want to serve in an EOC, then I would suggest that you get IS 275. And if you just fall in love with it like I do, you go on to IS 2200, because there are roles that you can do in there. Logistics, how do you find things? People need stuff in a disaster. How can you help find that? Being the public information person, even if you're not the mouthpiece, there's a lot of things that have to go on in the background for that to happen. Volunteer, people management, like you said, volunteers spontaneously. How do you manage that? Those are other things that are really critical. But it's like Carrie said, you don't have time as a manager during the event to start dealing with hundreds of people that want to come help and all of those things. So as I had said, a donation center, you set up, you receive it, you track it, you distribute it. That takes a lot of manpower and a lot of organization. If you have great organizational skills and you think detailed like that and you can manage things, that's you. I would love to have you doing that service, because that's what it takes. Animals, a lot of times your local animal shelter won't have additional staff to deal with animals that have gotten loose from a disaster. So they're going to need somebody to help with that additional animals, to take them in, to help find the owners, that whole side. And then, like I said, the backside of PIO, social media. If you have photography as a second love or something, documenting again what's going on, because pictures and documentation, especially when FEMA comes in, is just critical. So, and this is just an example of some ways you can help. Again, I would suggest you talk to the folks in your community, figure out what their needs are, and talk with them about how you can help. And the more you can talk their language, the more comfortable they're going to feel in getting you involved in the process. So, I would love to have people. We do have folks that volunteer. We actually, the gentleman that it coordinates all of our communication in the EOC during a disaster is a retired veterinarian, but he has a passion for it. He's gone to trainings, he's done everything, but he is purely 100% a volunteer. So we too use volunteers in the EOC. So it can be done. And I know that people out in the state would love to have additional resources that they can call upon. So again, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all and share experiences. You had a lot of great questions. And if you think of anything later, somebody, Holly or someone can let me know, and I'll be happy to answer other questions or Carrie to help you with your resources. So.
Thank you so much, Pat. We really appreciate your time and your expertise. You've shared a ton of information with us, and I know that we've had a bunch of questions from people. Everybody give Pat a round of applause, or you can write your comments in the chat box. But thank you all so much. Does anybody have any questions for Pat? Anything related either to the content that she shared with us today or other information about disasters that's been on your mind over the past few months? Does anybody have any questions? You can raise your hand or
I'm
unmute
going
yourself.
to share a question that's in the chat. Victoria asked, how can we find IS 275? It's not listed in the trainings available on FEMA. It jumps from 274 to 279A.
Sometimes FEMA changes things out. I'll have to look and see, and I can let you know, Carrie.
Okay.
Sometimes they renumber them. Sometimes they take them off because they're updating the content. So I will let you know that and see if there is a replacement for that.
And then the other thing that I was going to tell you guys, and before we get back to more questions, is please remember that we at Serve Kentucky and your programs recognize that now that we've all had a taste of how awful disasters can be. I mean, West Liberty, it was a terrible disaster, and I remember responding to it ages ago, but it's been so long ago for some of us, and some of us weren't even, we were little kids and then we didn't even know. And so for a lot of us, what's happening now is real and it's current, and we're really wanting to get involved. And so we at Serve Kentucky and your programs are looking to how we are going to be a part of disaster response in Kentucky for the AmeriCorps and for our future. And so we are putting together resources. We are going to try to work with partners like Pat and others who can help us be better prepared to respond and to help, and all of the various things that we can do in a cycle to be a part of that. And so we are looking at that, and your program directors are going to get back with you, and we'll talk about more of this. And much like a disaster, this is going to be a long-term effort that's going to take us a little while to coordinate and get together, but we're going to do it collaboratively and together, and we hope that you guys will want to be a part of that.
And I'm absolutely thrilled that you all are doing this. It's a great thing.
So if you have any other questions, please feel free to just raise your hand, throw them in the chat, or just start talking.
We will share the slides with people as well as a recording of the event. So if you had any connection issues, don't worry, we'll make sure all of this information is available. And just to dovetail onto what Carrie said and what Pat's been saying throughout the course of the training today, there's things that you all can do as individuals, and you don't necessarily have to be the person who's out, practicing CPR or, moving debris around. You can help out in all these different ways. And there's all these different types of trainings and certifications you can get that will empower you to be helpful if a disaster strikes in your area. And on top of that, we want you all to think about what would you like to do in the course of your service? What's something that you think your AmeriCorps program could do that would be helpful in other disasters? And talk to your program directors and let them know, so that way we can figure out the ways that your Corps can help out should disaster arise in your community.
Pat, I wanted to ask you a quick question. So I started the CERT training that Shelley was putting together that right before the pandemic started, and I had CERT training, I don't know, like 2008 or 9. And you mentioned earlier that people can start a CERT. How might somebody go about something like that? So if you want to try to get a CERT started in your area, who would be the people to contact, or what kind of steps would you need to take?
You can, from my knowledge, you can do it through either the local health department, the police or fire or the emergency management agency. So if you get any of those to kind of help be the sponsoring agency and to explain to them what it takes, we do ours. It's not all us. We have the fire department teach certain classes. We have a doc from UK to teach certain things. So again, it's a community effort. We just are the ones that kind of coordinate and put it all together, but it's certainly not done just by us. So,
Yeah.
Talk to someone within your community, one of those public service agencies, and enlighten them as to what it is, how that could help them in what they do, and kind of go about it that way.
Okay.
If you need any assistance or anything like that, myself or Shelley, and we can hook you up with my CERT manager, would be glad to help in that process.
Great, thank you.
All right. Well, once again, Pat, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. We really appreciate it. Thank you for being part of this. And, our members and I thank you very much for doing this. We'd love to share this information around, and hopefully we can communicate with you in another capacity at some point in the near future.
Anytime, love to help. So, and if anyone's interested in helping out in Fayette County, just let me know. We take all volunteers too.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. And again, please remember that we will be putting together resources in the future that and your programs will share them with you. And we're gonna do a better job of AmeriCorps being a part of disaster response, recovery, mitigation, and preparedness in Kentucky. And so it's a long road, but we are going to work together, and we know that it's going to take some time. And we'll get something together, and you can work individually with your programs, and you as an individual can do some work in your own community. Because one of the other things that you hear a lot in disaster is all disasters are local. And so a lot of times the people that can help the most, because here's another issue you end up with disasters, and Pat, correct me if I'm wrong, when you get an influx of people, you have no place to put those people sometimes. And so when you respond to a disaster locally, you live there. So it's a little bit easier for you to come in and help, because then they don't have to worry about, where are you going to stay, and are they going to have to feed you, and do you have transportation to, so there's so many things. And so being really responsive to local disasters, because everybody has them. Kentucky is notorious for flooding. And so there's always floods that are going on in your communities, the snowstorms, ice storms, all of these things happen in your community on a regular basis. And sometimes the emergency offices don't have enough volunteers. And so there's lots of ways that you can help. Not every disaster has to be a huge event like the Western Kentucky disaster for you to be a meaningful part of it. And so just keep that in mind. And as you're going forward, as we grow our cohort of disaster response, that there's a lot you can still do on your own.
If I could just add one thing to what you're saying, Carrie.
Yeah.
And this is a statewide situation. Public safety divisions, police and fire, corrections are struggling to have enough staff right now. And so you don't want to do their daily job, but when they have things, like you said, smaller disasters or things, whether it's even with traffic control or something, there may be ways you can assist them with smaller disasters. So resources are not plentiful. So the more we have, the better the response and the recovery to the situation will be.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Everyone, we have our next training in this series is going to be on March 9th. So we will share information with you all about how to register for that. If you have not already, please put your name and the name of your AmeriCorps program in the chat box so we can give you all credit for participating. But we appreciate your time. Thank you for making time in your day to be part of this event. We hope it's been useful for you. And as I said, we will share the information and the recordings with you. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to Carrie, Holly, or myself, and we'll try to be, provide clarification for you. But otherwise, you're free to go. Have a great day, and thank you for your participation.
Thank you, everyone.
If you're listening by phone, how can you put your name in? Or can I just tell you my name?
You can tell me your name, I'll add you.
Okay, Debbie Turay, Turay.
Okay. We will get you on
Thank
the
you.
list. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
All right.
When we leave, would the survey start?
That's right. As soon as you exit, you should get those 5 questions. Please fill out the 5-question survey after you're done. It shouldn't take more than a minute or 2.
Have a good day, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, LaDonna.
Galaxy. AO2S. Nope, she's gone. I was going to say, I'd try to get her name.
Carrie, I believe I have her name.
Hopefully everybody put their names in the chat. And I think in the past, I've also been able to email the programs and say, hey, we had these phone numbers that showed up. Do can you reach out to your members to see if they belong to anybody? So I've done that before. So if we end up missing some people, I'm sure we can find a way to, or a lot of times they'll just call me and say, hey, you have a list that you published and I have members that said they attended and they weren't on the list. So
Right.
I
Well,
thought
I'll
we
be able-
captured that information when they registered, didn't we, Holly?
We did. And I'll run an attendance report at the end too, because it'll show how long they were on.
okay,
Okay.
awesome.
Um,
All right, so we've got some members still on board. If you have some questions, feel free to unmute yourself and we'll try to answer those questions. Otherwise, you're free to go.
Holly, this has been, the connection went really well. So I don't know if it went well on your end, but I had one member who had a little difficulty, but I saw her pop in. And so I was just real impressed.
Thank you.
Yeah, so yay.
I was really worried because it said my connection was unstable. So I'm like,
Well, we all stayed connected, so that
well,
was
good.
Yeah.
If you all want to stay on for just a few minutes, once everyone logs off, and Ted, you can join us if you'd like. We can just sort of discuss this little session and some feedback moving forward.
We've got quite a few people on.
Yeah, sometimes people